I had never imagined that doing this with my dog when my husband was away could turn into the most exciting day of my life. It all started a couple of weeks ago when my husband left me and our dog, Bailey, at the house, leaving for a business trip. The house was always quiet when he was gone, the kind of silence that felt heavier than the absence of sound. I'd grown used to it over the years. His business trips were frequent, each lasting days or even weeks. It wasn't that I begrudged his work, it paid for our cozy suburban life, the sprawling backyard, and the home that felt too big for just the two of us. Or, as it often seemed, just for me and Bailey. Bailey, our golden retriever, was my constant companion. He had been part of our family for 5 years now, ever since we picked him up as a fluffy, clumsy puppy. Over time, his presence had become my anchor. While my husband worked long hours or traveled to distant cities, Bailey was there, greeting me with a wagging tail, a warm nuzzle, and those soulful eyes that seemed to understand far more than a dog should. Tonight was one of those nights, the kind where I felt the weight of the empty house pressing down on me. I tried filling the silence with music, the TV, even an audiobook, but nothing helped. After dinner, a lonely affair with leftovers reheated in the microwave, I curled up on the couch with a glass of wine. Bailey sprawled at my feet. He always stayed close, as if sensing that I needed him more on these nights. I reached down, letting my hand rest on his thick golden fur. "You're all I've got tonight." "Huh?" I murmured, my voice barely louder than a whisper. Bailey responded with a low, contented huff, his tail thumping softly against the floor. The bond we shared had always been special. He was more than just a pet. He was a confidant, a presence that filled the gaps left by my husband's absence. Over time, I'd begun to notice how much I relied on him, how his quiet companionship brought me a comfort I couldn't find elsewhere. It wasn't just his loyalty or his gentle nature, it was the way he seemed to truly see me, as if he understood the parts of myself I didn't know how to share. The evening stretched on, the minutes ticking by with an almost maddening slowness. I scrolled aimlessly through my phone, glancing at pictures of friends and their families. Their lives, full of noise and chaos, made the silence of my own life feel even more profound. Bailey shifted beside me, his head resting on my lap now, and I couldn't help but smile. At least I wasn't entirely alone. I ran my fingers through his fur, feeling the warmth of his body against mine. "You're such a good boy," I said softly. His tail wagged in response, and he let out a pleased sigh. Moments like this made me grateful for him, for the uncomplicated love he offered so freely. It wasn't the same as having my husband here, but it was enough to make the loneliness bearable. Eventually, the wine began to work its magic, the edges of my thoughts softening as I sank deeper into the couch. Bailey shifted again, curling up beside me in a way that made it feel like he was trying to shield me from the empty house. I reached down, brushing my hand along his back, and found myself talking to him without really thinking about it. "You know, Bailey, sometimes I wonder if he even notices how much time he spends away," I said, my voice quieter now. "I mean, I get it. He's busy. He's doing what he has to do. But sometimes I wish he'd just be here." Bailey's ears twitched, and he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a kind of understanding that made my chest ache. It was ridiculous, I knew, to project my feelings onto him, but in that moment, it felt like he understood me in a way no one else did. "You get it, don't you?" I continued, my hand still stroking his fur. "You're here. You always are." The room grew quieter still, the only sounds the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustle of Bailey's breathing. I let my hand rest on his side, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. It was calming, grounding, in a way I desperately needed. The silence no longer felt so oppressive with Bailey beside me. It was almost comforting. As the night wore on, I found myself reflecting on the life my husband and I had built. It wasn't bad, not by any stretch. We had a nice house, financial stability, and a routine that worked for the most part. But somewhere along the way, it had begun to feel hollow, like something was missing. I couldn't pinpoint when it started, but the distance between us had grown. A quiet chasm neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. Bailey nudged my hand with his nose, pulling me out of my thoughts. I smiled down at him, grateful for the distraction. "Thanks, buddy," I said, scratching behind his ears. "You always know when I need you, don't you?" He wagged his tail, his eyes shining with a warmth that made my heart ache. It was moments like these that reminded me how much he meant to me, how much he had become a part of my life in ways I hadn't expected. He wasn't just a dog, he was a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. I stayed on the couch with Bailey for hours, the weight of the evening slowly lifting as his presence filled the empty spaces. By the time I finally got up to head to bed, I felt lighter, more at peace. Bailey followed me, as he always did, curling up on his bed at the foot of mine. As I turned off the light and lay down, I found myself whispering into the darkness. "Good night, Bailey. Thank you for being here." While I said goodbye to him, something struck me all of a sudden. The look in his eyes excited me. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the loneliness. The longing to feel some excitement when you're alone with your dog that often. I just don't know. At least I didn't know yet, at that moment. Later on, I would definitely find out. And it made me do things I would have never imagined. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of Bailey's tail thumping against the floor. He always seemed to know when I needed an extra push to start the day. His golden eyes peeked over the edge of the bed, and I couldn't help but smile as he let out a low, cheerful bark, almost like he was saying, "Good morning, let's get moving." I swung my legs over the side of the bed, scratching his head as he nuzzled against me. All right, I'm up," I said with a chuckle. Bailey darted to the bedroom door, pausing to look back at me, as if urging me to follow. It was our routine now, his quiet insistence that life goes on, even when the house felt too big and too quiet without my husband around. After breakfast, Bailey trotted to the sliding glass door leading to the backyard, his tail wagging in anticipation. I grabbed his leash from the hook by the door, and his excitement grew, his whole body vibrating with energy. A walk was exactly what I needed to clear my mind and shake off the remnants of last night's reflections. The neighborhood was still waking up, the streets quiet except for the occasional chirp of birds and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Bailey stayed close to my side as we walked, his leash slack, his steps matching mine. It was one of the things I loved most about him, his calm, steady presence. Even when the world felt chaotic, Bailey had a way of grounding me, reminding me to focus on the moment. As we passed the park, I decided to let him off the leash. He bounded ahead, his ears flopping as he ran. The sheer joy of it brought a smile to my face. Watching him like that, so free and full of life, always made me feel a little lighter. I sat on a nearby bench, letting the warmth of the sun wash over me as I kept an eye on Bailey. He was chasing a squirrel now, though his attempts were more playful than serious. "You're ridiculous. You know that?" I called out to him, laughing as he turned back toward me. His tail wagged furiously as he trotted over, his tongue lolling out of his mouth, before flopping down at my feet. For a while, we just sat there, the two of us, soaking in the quiet of the morning. I found myself talking to Bailey again, as I often did when it was just the two of us. There was something comforting about it. like he was a sounding board for the thoughts I couldn't quite say out loud to anyone else. "I don't know, Bailey," I began, leaning down to rub his ears. "Do you ever think about what life would be like if things were different? If we weren't stuck in this routine, day after day?" He looked up at me with those big, expressive eyes, and I could almost imagine him saying, "I'm listening." It was silly, of course, to think that he understood the complexities of my thoughts. But in moments like this, it felt like he did. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm grateful for what we have, but sometimes it feels like something's missing. You know? I sighed, leaning back against the bench. "Your dad, he's a good man, but he's always gone. And when he's here, it's like we're just going through the motions." Bailey let out a soft whine, resting his head on my knee, and I felt a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry," I said, scratching the top of his head. "You shouldn't have to listen to me ramble about all this." But Bailey didn't seem to mind. He stayed right there, his head on my knee, his tail giving a slow, steady wag. It was moments like these that reminded me how much I relied on him, not just as a pet, but as a companion, a friend who was always there when I needed him. As the morning wore on, we made our way back home. I spent the rest of the day tackling chores, the kind of mundane tasks that helped pass the time. Bailey followed me from room to room, his presence a constant comfort. He'd flopped down in the corner of whichever room I was in, his eyes tracking my movements as if to say, "I'm here. Don't worry." Later that evening, after dinner, I found myself back on the couch with Bailey curled up beside me. The loneliness I usually felt during my husband's absence was still there, but it wasn't as heavy as it had been the night before. Bailey had a way of filling the emptiness, of making the silence feel less oppressive. But still, I was missing something. And each time I looked at Bailey, he told me he could fill that void. I reached down to stroke his fur, my fingers trailing along the soft waves of his coat. "You're a lifesaver. You know that?" I said, my voice soft. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Bailey responded with a soft sigh, his tail thumping lazily against the couch. I smiled, leaning back and letting myself relax for the first time all day. The warmth of his body against mine was comforting, grounding in a way that nothing else seemed to be. As the evening stretched on, I found myself reflecting on the bond we shared. It wasn't just the loyalty or the companionship, though those things were certainly part of it. It was the way Bailey seemed to see me, to understand me in a way that felt almost human. He was more than just a dog. He was a reminder that I wasn't alone, even in the quietest, loneliest moments. I stayed on the couch with Bailey long after the sun had set. The two of us cocooned in the quiet warmth of our shared space. It wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself, but in that moment, it felt like enough. The days blurred together, the routine of my life steady but uninspiring. My husband's return was delayed again, another trip that had stretched longer than planned. I told myself I was fine with it. After all, I'd grown accustomed to his absences. Yet, as the days passed, I found myself leaning on Bailey more and more. It was late afternoon when I stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing dishes while Bailey lay sprawled in the doorway, his ears twitching in response to the faint sounds of the neighborhood. The golden light streaming through the window bathed the room in warmth, but I still felt cold inside. My thoughts wandered as I stared out at the backyard, the weight of my own loneliness pressing against me. "Bailey," I called softly, breaking the silence. He lifted his head, his eyes locking on mine, as if he could sense the shift in my mood. "Let's get out of here." Grabbing his leash, I led him to the car. We didn't have a destination in mind, but the act of leaving the house felt like a small rebellion against the monotony. Bailey sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, his fur ruffling in the breeze as I drove aimlessly through town. His joy was infectious, and I felt myself smiling for the first time that day. Eventually, we ended up at a nature reserve on the outskirts of town. The walking trails were quiet, the kind of place where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of birds. I let Bailey off his leash, watching as he bounded ahead, his tail wagging with enthusiasm. He'd always loved the outdoors, and seeing him so full of life eased the ache in my chest. I followed him down the trail, the soft crunch of gravel under my feet grounding me. Bailey darted between the trees, pausing every so often to glance back at me, as if to make sure I was still there. His energy was contagious, and I felt a sense of calm settle over me, the tension in my shoulders easing as I inhaled the crisp, clean air. As we walked, my thoughts drifted to the life I'd built with my husband. I loved him. At least I thought I did. But lately, that love felt more like a habit than a feeling, a quiet companionship that lacked the spark it once had. And in his absence, it was Bailey who had filled the void, his unwavering loyalty a balm to my restless heart. I found a quiet clearing and sat on a fallen log, watching as Bailey sniffed around, his tail wagging as he explored. He eventually wandered back to me, flopping down at my feet with a satisfied sigh. I reached down, scratching behind his ears, and he nuzzled against my hand, his warm, steady presence grounding me once again. "You're my rock. You know that?" I said, my voice soft. Bailey looked up at me, his expressive eyes filled with a warmth that made my chest tighten. It was moments like this that reminded me just how much he meant to me, how his presence had become a lifeline in a world that often felt too quiet. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. I stayed there with Bailey, the two of us cocooned in the peace of the moment. Time seemed to slow, the world outside the reserve fading away until it was just us. I felt a strange sense of clarity in that stillness, as if the weight of my thoughts had been lifted, leaving me free to simply exist. As we made our way back to the car, I realized how much I'd needed this time away from the house, from the routine, from the thoughts that had been circling my mind. Bailey trotted beside me, his steps in sync with mine, and I felt a surge of gratitude for him. He wasn't just my dog, he was my constant, my anchor, the one thing that made the loneliness bearable. The drive home was quiet, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Bailey curled up in the passenger seat, his head resting on his paws, his breathing steady and rhythmic. I reached over, letting my hand rest on his back, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't known I was searching for. When we arrived home, the house felt less empty, less oppressive. Bailey followed me inside, his tail wagging as he settled onto his bed by the couch. I sank onto the cushions, feeling a quiet sense of contentment. The bond one shared with Bailey was unlike anything else in my life, pure, uncomplicated, and steady. That night, as I lay in bed, Bailey at my feet, I found myself reflecting on the connection we shared. It wasn't something I could easily put into words, but it was real, tangible in a way that filled the empty spaces left by my husband's absence. Bailey wasn't just a dog to me, he was my partner, my confidant, and in many ways, my closest friend. And for now, that was enough, or was it? The following night was darker than usual, the kind of inky blackness that wrapped around the house and pressed against the windows. The air felt heavy, charged, as though a storm was waiting to break. Bailey padded beside me as I moved through the house, his steps silent, but his presence grounding. I hadn't turned on the lights, letting the faint glow of the moon guide me as I made my way to the couch. I sank into the cushions, Bailey settling beside me with his head on my lap. The quiet of the house was overwhelming, The absence of my husband a stark reminder of how much space he occupied. Even when he wasn't here, my hand found its way to Bailey's fur, stroking absent-mindedly as my thoughts swirled. "You're all I have right now," I murmured, my voice barely audible in the stillness. Bailey responded with a soft huff, his tail thumping against the couch. He looked up at me, his golden eyes filled with an understanding that made my chest ache. I let out a shaky breath, my hand stilling on his fur. "It's just us, isn't it? You and me." The words hung in the air, heavier than I intended. But Bailey didn't seem to mind. He nuzzled closer, his warmth seeping into me as the weight of my loneliness pressed harder. The connection between us felt different that night, stronger somehow. It wasn't just the comfort of his presence or the way he seemed to sense my every mood. It was something deeper, a bond that went beyond words or logic. I leaned back, closing my eyes as I let myself sink into the moment. The quiet, the warmth of Bailey against me. Time seemed to blur as we stayed like that. The two of us cocooned in the stillness. My hand moved to his head, my fingers trailing along the soft curve of his ears. He let out a low, contented sigh, his tail wagging gently against the couch. The sound of his breathing, steady and rhythmic, filled the room, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. I opened my eyes, glancing down at him. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The room, the empty house, the ache of my husband's absence. It all dissolved, leaving just the two of us. My hand lingered on his head, my fingers brushing through his fur as I felt an inexplicable pull, a connection so strong it left me breathless. Bailey shifted, pressing closer to me, his warmth balm to the cold emptiness that had settled in my chest. I leaned forward slightly, my forehead resting against his. As I closed my eyes again, letting the moment wash over me, it was unlike anything I'd ever felt. A mix of comfort and longing, of gratitude and something deeper that I couldn't quite name. "I don't know what I'd do without you," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. Bailey responded with a soft nuzzle, his nose brushing against my cheek as his tail wagged once more. It was as though he understood, as though he felt the same unspoken bond that had grown between us. The minutes stretched on, the world outside the house forgotten as I stayed there with Bailey. The connection between us wrapped around me like a lifeline. It wasn't just that he was here, that he was loyal and steady and always by my side. It was the way he made me feel seen, understood in a way I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't sure how long we stayed like that, but when I finally pulled back, my heart was racing, my breath shallow. Bailey's eyes were locked on mine, his expression calm but intense, as though he was waiting for something. My hand lingered on his head, my fingers trailing down to his collar as I struggled to find the words to explain what I was feeling. But there were no words for this, no way to capture the depth of what Bailey meant to me, of how his presence had filled the empty spaces in my life. All I could do was sit there, my hand on his fur, my heart pounding as I tried to process the moment. Eventually, I leaned back against the couch, my hand still resting on Bailey as he settled beside me once more. The weight of the moment lingered, a quiet reminder of the bond we shared, of the way he had become so much more than just a dog to me. As the night wore on, I felt a sense of clarity settle over me, the kind that came not from logic but from something deeper, something instinctive. Bailey had always been my anchor, my constant, in a world that often felt too chaotic, too lonely. And in that moment, I realized just how much I needed him, not just as a companion, but as a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't alone. The house was still silent as I eventually made my way to bed, Bailey following close behind. He curled up at the foot of the bed, his presence a quiet reassurance that I wasn't entirely alone. I lay there in the darkness, my thoughts still swirling, but my heart a little lighter, a little more at peace as I drifted off to sleep. I whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, Bailey, for everything." He was looking at me in a way he could feel what I felt, the loneliness, the desire for some excitement. His eyes were telling me he was the one who could give that to me when my husband was away. Something in me started to shift, asking myself if I needed to give in to those temptations. Maybe. I shook my head. No, I can't do this, although something in me definitely wanted to. A part of me wanted to find out what he was up to, and maybe later on, I would give in to that temptation, but not yet. I wasn't ready for it. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, casting a golden glow across the room. I blinked awake, the heaviness of the night before still lingering in the back of my mind. Bailey was already up, sitting patiently by the bed, his tail sweeping the floor in slow, deliberate movements. "Morning, buddy," I murmured, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. He leaned into my hand, his warm breath tickling my wrist. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a weight I hadn't noticed before. As I got ready for the day, Bailey followed me from room to room, his presence a quiet comfort. The events of the previous night lingered in my mind, vivid and raw, as though they had etched themselves into my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between us, though I wasn't sure what it meant. After breakfast, I found myself back on the couch, Bailey at my feet. The quiet of the house felt less oppressive today, more like a cocoon than a void. I let my fingers trail through Bailey's fur, my mind drifting as I tried to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. For years, I had buried my feelings, pushed them down beneath the surface to keep life running smoothly. But Bailey had a way of drawing them out of me, making me confront the loneliness I had tried so hard to ignore. His unwavering loyalty, his quiet understanding, had been a lifeline, one I hadn't realized I needed until it was too late. Bailey was looking at me with those eyes again, and all of a sudden, I just couldn't resist it anymore. We had a bond so close I just needed to give in. It was as if he was telling me that he could fill my void of loneliness with some excitement. I leaned in towards him, and he immediately knew. I kissed him, and there was such a tension between us that I can't quite name. His tail was moving very fast. Of course, I can't go into full details, but I can tell that I let myself go. I went on my knees and turned around. Wow! When Bailey was doing his thing, I could have never imagined that it could be that good. The bond we shared even strengthened what we were doing. It was so amazing. After, I think, 30 to 40 minutes, he finished, and I sighed, leaning back against the cushions. "What are we doing, Bailey?" I asked softly, my voice tinged with a mix of wonder and confusion. He looked up at me, his golden eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, it felt like he was waiting for an answer too. The rest of the day passed in a haze of mundane tasks and fleeting moments of clarity. I folded laundry, cleaned the kitchen, and walked Bailey through the neighborhood, all the while feeling the weight of the bond we shared pressing against me. It wasn't something I could ignore anymore, no matter how hard I tried. By the time evening rolled around, I felt restless, a nervous energy thrumming through me that I couldn't quite shake. I grabbed Bailey's leash and headed out the door, needing to clear my head. The air was crisp and cool, the faint scent of wood smoke drifting on the breeze as we made our way to the park. The paths were quiet, lit only by the soft glow of the street lamps and the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance. Bailey trotted beside me, his steps steady and confident as he matched my pace. I let him lead the way, trusting his instincts as we wandered deeper into the park. We eventually found ourselves at a secluded clearing, the grass damp with dew and the air humming with the quiet sounds of the night. I sat down on a bench, Bailey settling at my feet, his body warm against the coolness of the evening. The stars overhead were bright, scattered across the sky like shards of glass. And for a moment, I felt the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. Bailey shifted, resting his head on my knee, and I reached down to stroke his fur. The familiar motion grounded me. "You've always been here for me, haven't you?" I said softly, my voice carrying on the stillness of the night. Through everything, he responded with a quiet whine, his tail wagging against the ground. It was such a small thing, but it filled my chest with a warmth that chased away the lingering shadows of doubt and loneliness. Bailey wasn't just my dog, he was my partner, my anchor, my constant in a world that often felt too big and too empty. As the minutes stretched into hours, I found myself speaking aloud, the words spilling out like water from a dam. I told Bailey about my fears, my doubts, the ache of a marriage that had become more routine than connection. I spoke of the nights spent alone, of the moments when his presence had been the only thing keeping me from falling apart. And through it all, Bailey stayed by my side, his quiet presence a reassurance that I wasn't alone. His loyalty, his love, was unlike anything I'd ever known, and it filled the spaces in my heart that I hadn't realized were empty. The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that felt full of meaning rather than emptiness. Bailey curled up in the passenger seat, his eyes closing as the rhythm of the road lulled him to sleep. I glanced over at him, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips as I reached out to brush my fingers against his fur. When we got home, the house felt warmer, more inviting than it had in weeks. Bailey followed me to the couch, settling beside me as I curled up beneath a blanket. The quiet companionship we shared was enough, a reminder that even in the loneliest moments, I wasn't truly alone. I let my head rest against the back of the couch, my fingers tracing absent patterns through Bailey's fur. "You're my rock," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "You've always been my rock." Bailey shifted closer, his body pressed against mine as his tail wagged softly. The connection between us was undeniable, a bond that went beyond words or explanation. It was something I didn't fully understand, but I knew it was real, and that was enough. As the hours ticked by, the house grew quieter, the world outside fading into the stillness of the night. I stayed on the couch with Bailey, his presence a steady comfort as I let myself drift into a peaceful haze. Whatever the future held, I knew one thing for certain: Bailey would be there, his loyalty unwavering, his love a constant in a world that so often felt unpredictable. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity, a quiet certainty that I wasn't alone. And as I drifted off to sleep, Bailey curled up beside me. I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. When he lay there beside me, I was questioning myself if it was okay what we had done. Am I just weird? Or is this pretty normal? I just don't know. What do you think of it? Please let me know in the comments. Thank you.